Welcome back. July 9th, 2021. Peggy Noonan has an interesting column this morning. The Culture War is a Leftist Offense, it's titled. She quotes a prominent socialist writer, Kevin Drum, who points out that if you hate culture wars, blame liberals. His point, as he states it, it's not conservatives who have turned American politics into a cultural war battle. Since roughly the year 2000, according to survey data, Democrats have moved significantly to the left on most hot-button social issues, while Republicans have moved only slightly to the right. He cites data on issues from abortion and religion to guns, same-sex marriage, immigration, taxes. The numbers suggest the obvious conclusion that over the past 2 decades, Democrats have moved left far more than Republicans have moved right. He's not personally unhappy with this, but Democrats should be concerned they're moving further away from median voters. Black conservatives and Hispanic conservatives, one scholar notes, don't actually buy into a lot of these intellectual theories of racism. They often have a very different conception of how to help black or Hispanic communities than liberals do. This was my point yesterday. I think when it comes to critical race theory, 1619, and even the BLM curricula, I'm of the thought there are higher percentages of Keisha Kings and Glenn Lowrys in the black community opposed to this kind of junk thought than there are whites who support it. Almost all of this subtextual, postmodern intellectual anarchy comes from European scholars, not African-American scholars. From the likes of your Jacques Derrida, your Paul Damon, and Jean Baudrillard. A funny thing happened with what the French here produced, though, and that is that American intellectuals took all of what they were saying just a bit too seriously. Talk about a Leviathan eating its own tail. It fuels secessionism, gnaws at national unity, abets Islamism, attacks France's intellectual and cultural heritage. The threat? Certain social science theories entirely imported from the United States, and I'm quoting the president of France, Emmanuel Macron. The New York Times writes that French politicians, high-profile intellectuals, and journalists are warning that progressive American ideas, specifically on race, gender, and colonialism, are undermining their society. There's a battle to wage against an intellectual matrix from American universities, warned Mr. Macron's education minister. Emboldened by these comments, prominent intellectuals have come together against what they regard as a combination by the out-of-control woke leftism of American campuses and its attendant cancel culture. Got that? Not even the French, who gave us all this crud, want it anymore. Give the French this. They know the importance of culture, at least their culture, and they are willing to defend it. They don't need lectures and do not engage in debates about nationalism in France. They have pride in who they are and do not doubt their very existence, exactly what the French philosopher Jean-François Revel taught us, but we ignored. Now, what's fun is though the French are fighting back against their very own Frankenstein, we on the right are usually criticized for engaging the culture and the culture wars. I get why. When they come up, the left loses because of overreach. I have no idea why soi-disant conservatives keep telling us to drop it. The left isn't dropping it, so my view is we can fight it or lose to it. My thought is this. As Abraham Lincoln put it about a real culture war, a hot one, took place in the 19th century, quote, both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. Close quote. Historically enough, and ironically enough, it was and is the Democrats in both cases that would make the war. The question is whether Republicans and conservatives will accept it this time. I wrote all about this at some lengths a few years ago in our book, American Greatness, Culture Wars. It's a phrase toxic and noxious to most Republican political analysts. Abortion, marriage, family, race, religion, education, patriotism, crime, drugs, illegal immigration. Stay away, they say, too divisive, as if there's anything else to talk about besides taxes. Those issues caricature the party and the movement, they will tell us. We want 60 to 80% issues, they will tell us. We can't afford to lose the suburban vote or the women's vote, or we have to do better with the Hispanic population, they will tell us. The party, after all, aren't we told, is basically economically conservative and basically socially moderate. That's the comfortable thing for the donor class to say at their donor class events. Well, yes, I'm a Republican, but not that kind of Republican. I'm socially moderate, but economically conservative. If there is one kind of speech Republican consultants know not to mimic or come close to, it's the speech Patrick Buchanan gave at the 1992 Republican Convention, the speech where he spoke so dramatically of a culture war. The Buchanan speech in 1992, coming right after the Los Angeles Rodney King riots, was indeed a stemwinder. Its most memorable lines, however, were descriptive, not prescriptive. Pat Buchanan was not calling for a culture war. He was describing one. He said, quote, "There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war, as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself. For this war is for the soul of America," close quote. From there, Buchanan spoke about jobs and the economy. Teams of supporters who had told him their stories about lost jobs and shuttered factories. Environmental regulations that cared more about owls than people. And then he spoke of and concluded his speech with a story of two policemen he met who helped push back and dissuade rioters in Los Angeles from further mayhem. Here's what he said, quote, "They had come into Los Angeles late into the evening of the second day, and the rioting was still going on. And two of them walked up a dark street where the mob had burned and looted every single building on the block but one, a convalescent home for the aged. And the mob was headed in to ransack and loot the apartments of the terrified old men and old women inside. The troopers came up the street, M16s at the ready, and the mob threatened and cursed, but the mob retreated because it had met one thing that could stop it: force rooted in justice and backed by moral courage. Greater love than this hath no man, than that he lay down his life for his friend." Here we were, 19-year-old boys, ready to lay down their lives to stop a mob from molesting old people they did not even know. And as those boys took back the streets of Los Angeles, block by block, my friends, we must take back our cities and take back our culture and take back our country, close quote. That was the gravamen and peroration of Buchanan's culture war speech. It wasn't heavy on abortion, mentioned the issue twice very briefly. The words race and affirmative action appear nowhere in the speech. Its only mention of prayer in school was that George H.W. Bush supported voluntary prayer. Opposition to gay marriage received one sentence. This was 1992. Remember reading or listening to the Buchanan speech that consultants today warn of because it is too incendiary and divisive. One can conclude candidates are instructed to stay away from the issues of law and order, the defense of police, the celebration of justice, and harmony kept by the moral force of the laws backed by the sacrifice and presence of the police. Rereading that speech, one might say it was more Richard Nixon, 1968, speaking of the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators, than the Christian Coalition or moral majority of, say, a Pat Buchanan or a Jerry Falwell or a James Dobson or Franklin Graham. It was about safe streets and putting down and stopping riots. That was the essence of the culture war that we were all instructed was too divisive and turned off the majority of Americans. To be sure, politicians running for national office stayed away from that kind of talk or phraseology. Try to recall John McCain in 2008 or Mitt Romney in 2012, or for that matter, Bob Dole in 1996. All candidates who lost ever talking about those things. But the conservative movement did not stay away from those issues, nor did the conservative think tanks. And looking at the losses of Republican presidential campaigns from moderates and traditional Republicans like Dole, McCain, and Romney, who truly did stay away from anything like culture speak, one wonders if that may not have been part of their strategic mistake. It would be of some irony, and a point we will return to later, that George Bush's election to the presidency in 2000 became a reality due to a Supreme Court decision from a court the first culture warriors took the scalp from, and that is Robert Bork, who should have been sitting on that court at that time, but it was deprived and denied him because Democrats and the left had no problem engaging in culture wars with atomic rhetoric. Think of the worst and most traveled things said about Bob Bork during his confirmation hearings in 1987. They are the words of Ted Kennedy, quote, Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police would break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, school children could not be taught about evolution, writers and artists could be censored at the whim of the government, and the doors of the federal courts would be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens for whom the judiciary is and is often the only protector of. That was wholly unfair and an untrue attack on the judicial philosophy of Robert Bork, but it had purchase, and as I say, it traveled. Interesting to think about that indictment right now in those words and how conservatives are treated by the left. But the larger point, the left, the liberal movement in America, and Democrats had no problem engaging in culture wars, whether they be subtly or not so subtly. Meanwhile, for decades, Republicans were urged not to so engage. Indeed, they were urged to triangulate those issues, water them down, or simply ignore them. For these kinds of reasons, one of the heroines of the intellectual conservative movement, Midge Decter, would often say, the Republican Party is the cross the conservative movement has to constantly bear. Why do I recite all this? Because what I fear is too many Republicans forget that conservatism is first and foremost, and has been first and foremost, about our culture. Feel free to start with William Buckley's very first book about the problems in higher education. Feel free to move to his second book about communism in America, or the Goldwater and Reagan books and speeches in the 1960s about how the human condition is traduced by socialism here and abroad. Goldwater wrote in Chapter 1 of The Conscience of a Conservative that man is a spiritual being, and that, quote, man's most sacred possession is his individual soul, which has an immortal side, but also a mortal one. The mortal side establishes his absolute differentness from every other human being. Only a philosophy that takes into account the essential differences between men and accordingly makes provision for developing the different potentialities of each man can be claimed to have accord with nature. Close quote. The best lights of our movement in the 80s and 90s certainly saw us as a cultural movement, from the books of Dinesh D'Souza to Alan Bloom to Shelby Steele. Of course, there's your William J. Bennett's, and you have your Midge Decters and your Charles Murrays and your Heather MacDonalds and your Irving Kristals, and Norman Podhoritz's. These were all writers on our culture. Vice President Dan Quayle may have been scorned by the elites for his Murphy Brown speech in 1992, warning about the problems of out-of-wedlock birth. But William Buckley would write, before Quayle's speech, same month, there's only one question to ask a presidential candidate that makes any sense, and it is this: what do you propose to do about the rate of illegitimate births? Soon following, more conservative intellectual attention rose to this issue as well, with the famous 1994 Irving Kristol essay, Life Without Father, and a whole series of books and conferences and nonprofits dedicated to thinking through and solving the issues of fatherlessness and out-of-wedlock birth. My point, if crime and safety and community are the cultural issues before us, fine, bring it on. Who brought those issues to us? A reactionary Republican movement called Some Lives Matter More Than Others? A violent conservative movement called Antil or anti-leftism? No. And whose idea was it to bow to when it wasn't ignoring Marxist-inspired violence? Republicans? No. The first duty of government is safety. We know this from the Federalist Papers. The first duty of politics is the protection of the community. We know this from Aristotle. If the determination of whether we, in Ronald Reagan's words, are now fighting once again between man's age-old dream, the ultimate in individual freedom, consistent with law and order, or down to the ant heap of totalitarianism? Who brought us that fight? We know that answer, as we knew it in Lincoln's day. One side would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. Please let us accept it. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.